The shimmering glass of the containment pod reflected the sterile light of the research chamber. Dr. Traskin stood before it. His 4 eyes narrowed with curiosity as he adjusted the input on his translator. The creature inside, human, subject 74, sat silently on the cold bench, his expression unreadable. "Remarkably calm for a species so fragile," Traskin muttered, his gray-blue tendrils quivering with intellectual excitement. "And yet, they endure." Behind him, the hum of the station's AI system provided a soft undercurrent to the faint clinking of tools. His assistant, Valara, handed him a data slate. "The psychological baseline readings are extraordinary," she said, her voice tinged with the practiced detachment of a scientist. "Adrenaline spikes are oddly consistent, though. It's almost as if they control it." Traskin's mandibles clicked together. "Control it? Impossible. Such responses are automatic in every species ever recorded." Valara shrugged with 2 of her 6 shoulders. "Humans seem to defy many biological norms. Their resilience in extreme environments alone—" "Speculation," Traskin interrupted, his voice sharp. "We need evidence. Prepare the stressor protocols." Valara hesitated. "We've already performed levels 1 and 2. Stressor level 3? That's necessary," he snapped. "Do it." She turned, reluctantly, her claws tapping commands into a console. A low hiss filled the room as a section of the containment pod's wall slid open, revealing a nozzle. Traskin watched intently as gas began to seep into the enclosure, its pale green tendrils curling like ghostly fingers around the human. The gas was designed to simulate a noxious atmosphere that would incapacitate most known species. Garrett, the human, tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. He coughed once, a wet, hacking sound that echoed in the otherwise silent chamber. Then he stood, muscles taut beneath his jumpsuit, his gaze locked onto Traskin through the glass. "Is it watching us?" Valara asked, unease creeping into her voice. Traskin waved a dismissive claw. "It's merely observing its environment. Instinct." Inside the pod, Garrett stepped forward, placing his hand against the glass. The skin beneath his fingertips turned red, and faint streaks of moisture appeared on the pane. "Fascinating," Traskin murmured, leaning closer. "Its heat regulation system is remarkable." Valara shifted uneasily, her dorsal plates bristling. "Doctor, I think we should—" "More gas," Traskin interrupted, his voice trembling with the excitement of discovery. "Let's see how far its limits extend." Valara hesitated, then tapped another command. The hissing intensified, the chamber filling with the toxic haze. Garrett staggered, his knees buckling. He fell forward, catching himself on the glass. His breath fogged the pane, and for a moment he seemed to falter. Then he smiled. Traskin froze. The smile wasn't one of desperation or fear. It was a challenge, a grim declaration of defiance. Garrett pressed his forehead against the glass, his teeth bared. "What is it doing?" Valara whispered. Before Traskin could respond, Garrett slammed his fist against the glass. A loud crack reverberated through the chamber. Valara gasped, and Traskin took an involuntary step back. "That's impossible," Traskin muttered, his voice shaking. The pod is reinforced." Another strike. The glass spiderwebbed, fractures spreading outward from the impact. Garrett stepped back, his body heaving as he drew in a long, measured breath. Valara was already at the console, her claws flying over the controls. Activating restraints," she said, her voice tight with panic. The pod's floor lit up with an electric blue glow as the restraint system engaged, but Garrett was faster. With one final ferocious blow, he shattered the glass. Shards rained onto the floor as the alarm screamed to life. Garrett stepped out, his movements eerily calm. Blood dripped from his knuckles, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes locked on to Trask's skin, and in that moment, the alien felt a chill unlike anything he'd ever known. "Subject is loose!" Valara shouted. "Security!" Garrett's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "You shouldn't have done that." Traskin's translator barely kept up, but the tone needed no interpretation. This wasn't the reaction of a creature pushed to its limits. It was the beginning of something far worse. The sharp klaxon of the station's alarms blended with the frantic patter of Valara's claws on the console. Dr. Traskin backed away from the shattered pod, his tendrils twitching as Garrett stepped forward. His posture relaxed, yet brimming with latent menace. "Contain him!" Traskin barked, his voice high with panic. "Activate secondary restraints!" Valara's hands trembled as she obeyed. A burst of energy shimmered from the floor near Garrett's feet, manifesting as glowing blue bands that arced toward his ankles. Garrett paused, watching the restraints snake toward him, and then he moved. A single step forward, and the restraints fizzled out as if they had encountered a wall of static. Garrett looked down at the blue arcs, one eyebrow raised, and then his gaze lifted to meet Traskin's. He smiled again, this time more deliberate, calculated. "Something's wrong with the systems," Valara stammered, her dorsal plates quivering as she worked. "They're unresponsive to the human's biosignature." "What do you mean, unresponsive?" Traskin demanded, his voice cracking. "Override them!" I've tried!" Valara shouted back, her sick shoulders visibly trembling. It's as if he's..." Garrett interrupted her with a low, slow clap. The sound echoed through the sterile chamber, underscoring the growing tension. "You're not used to things fighting back, are you?" he said, his tone conversational, almost mocking. Traskin's translator struggled to keep up, the clipped syllables losing some of their bite in the alien's language. Garrett took another step forward, his bare feet crunching on shards of glass. His eyes scanned the room, calculating. We have gods," Traskin said more to himself than anyone else, though he forgot to turn off his translator. "Armed gods." "They won't be enough," Garrett replied, his voice carrying an eerie certainty. As if summoned, the lab's double doors hissed open, and two heavily armed alien guards entered, their weapons, streamlined energy lances that hummed with suppressed power, were leveled at Garrett in an instant. "Down!" one guard ordered, his voice harsh and guttural. Garrett raised his hands slowly, palms outward, and tilted his head in mock compliance. "Sure," he said, and then he dropped. Not to the floor, but toward the nearest guard. The movement was a blur. Garrett closed the distance before the guard could fire. His hand shot out, grabbing the barrel of the energy lance and twisting it upward. A blast of searing energy punched into the ceiling, sending sparks raining down. With a swift kick, Garrett sent the guard sprawling, disarmed. The second guard hesitated, a fatal mistake. Garrett hurled the confiscated lance, its heavy frame striking the alien's chest with enough force to send him crashing into a console. The lance discharged, shattering a nearby monitor and plunging part of the lab into darkness. "By the stars," Valara whispered, frozen in place. Traskin stumbled backwards, his tendrils writhing in panicked spirals. This is impossible," he muttered. It's an anomaly, a glitch in their biology." Garrett turned toward him, his expression hardening. "You're starting to understand," he said, his voice low. "We're not like you." He advanced slowly, his bloodied hands leaving faint streaks on the floor. Traskin fumbled for a weapon, but his clawed fingers found only air. Valara was still at the console, frantically inputting commands, her voice a near hysterical mutter of alien curses. "You wanted to see how far I could go, right?" Garrett continued, his tone conversational again. "Now, you're going to find out." A loud hiss interrupted him. Behind Garrett, another set of doors opened, and more guards poured in. 6, this time, all armed and wary. Garrett paused, glancing over his shoulder. His expression didn't change. "More?" he asked, almost amused. "Fine." Before the guards could react, Garrett moved again. This time, his actions were even more fluid, more deliberate. He dodged energy blasts with uncanny precision, using the room's layout to his advantage. A leap carried him onto a console, and he launched himself into the midst of one of the guards, a whirlwind of fists and fury. Traskin watched in stunned silence as the guards fell one by one, their weapons clattering uselessly to the floor. Garrett didn't kill them. He didn't need to. Each strike was precise, incapacitating without hesitation. Finally, the last guard crumpled to the ground, groaning. Garrett stood among the wreckage, breathing heavily, but grinning like a predator who had just toyed with his prey. "You've underestimated us," he said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. Traskin's translator sputtered, struggling to keep up with the rapid, guttural syllables. Valara froze, her claws hovering over the console. "What are you?" she managed to choke out. Garrett turned his gaze to her, his smile fading into something colder. "Survivors," he said simply, and then strode toward the doors, leaving the broken guards and shattered equipment in his wake. The station's alarms continued to blare, their urgent wail a grim prelude to what was coming next. The corridors of the research station echoed with chaos. Lights flickered in uneven bursts, casting jagged shadows that danced against the metallic walls. Emergency klaxons blared, each shrill note punctuating the frantic activity of the alien staff as they scrambled for solutions. Or, failing that, escape. Garrett moved through the station with the unsettling composure of a predator in unfamiliar terrain. His bare feet made no sound against the cold alloy floors, as his every step was deliberate, as though he were mapping the entire structure in his head. Around him, containment fields sputtered and failed, flickering into uselessness. "They thought they could control us," he muttered to himself, his voice low and even. "Let's show them how wrong they were." Dr. Traskin leaned heavily on the lab console, his tendrils trembling with panic. The control room was a mess of broken monitors and overturned equipment, the result of Garrett's earlier encounter with the guards. Valara was nearby, frantically working at the last operational terminal. "How is this happening?" Traskin demanded, his voice a mix of anger and fear. "How is one creature, doing this?" Valara didn't look up. Her claws danced over the console, her dorsal plates bristling. "It's not just him," she said, her voice tight. The other humans, they're acting strange." Traskin's tendrils froze mid-quiver. "Strange how?" Valara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the data streaming across the screen. "Coordinated," she said finally. "They've broken out of their pods somehow. They're moving as if they're connected." Traskin's eyes narrowed. "Connected? That's impossible. They're primitive, isolated individuals. They lack—" "Tell that to the 6 security teams we've already lost!" Valara snapped, cutting him off. "They're moving together, Doctor. They're communicating, somehow." Traskin stared at her, his mind racing. "We need to isolate them. Shut down sections of the station. Vent the atmosphere, if necessary." Valara hesitated, her claws hovering over the console. "If we do that, we'll kill everyone still in those sections." "Do it!" Traskin hissed, his voice rising. "Before they reach—" An explosion rocked the station, throwing both aliens to the floor. Sparks rained down from the ceiling, and a deep groaning sound echoed through the walls, as if the station itself were crying out in pain. "They're in the reactor wing," Valara gasped, struggling to her feet. If they breach the core... They won't, Traskin interrupted, his voice shaky but firm. We'll stop them. Valara didn't respond. The disbelief on her face was all the response she needed. Garrett crouched in the shadows of the reactor wing, his breathing steady. The area was a maze of towering machinery and thick, glowing conduits. The hum of the reactor filled the air, a low, steady vibration that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Around him, other humans moved silently, their faces set with grim determination. They had no weapons, but their resolve was palpable. Garrett glanced at each of them, nodding once. They nodded back. "Stick to the plan," he whispered. "Disable their systems, then regroup." The others fanned out, disappearing into the shadows. Garrett stayed where he was, his eyes scanning the area for signs of movement. He didn't have to wait long. A squad of alien guards entered the reactor wing, their energy lances raised. They moved cautiously, their eyes darting to every corner. One of them, a tall, armored figure with a reptilian gait, gestured for the others to spread out. Garrett watched them, his body tensed like a coiled spring. He waited until the last possible moment. He struck like lightning, his movements a blur. Before the nearest guard could react, Garrett had closed the distance, slamming an elbow into the alien's throat. The guard crumpled without a sound. Garrett snatched the energy lance from the fallen alien, spinning to face the others. The remaining guards opened fire, their weapons blazing. Garrett dove behind a conduit, the heat of the energy blast singeing his skin. He leaned out just enough to fire the lance. The weapon's recoil jolting up his arm as a bolt of energy struck one of the guards square in the chest. The others hesitated, their formation breaking. It was all the opening Garrett needed. He surged forward, using the terrain to his advantage, his movements fluid and precise. Within moments, the squad lay incapacitated, their weapons scattered around them. Garrett stood over the last guard, his chest heaving. The alien stared up at him, its eyes wide with fear. "You should have left us alone," Garrett said softly. Then he turned and disappeared into the shadows. In the control room, Traskin watched in horror as the feed from the reactor wing went dark. The last thing he saw was Garrett's face, illuminated by the glow of an energy lance. "They've taken the reactor," Valara said, her voice hollow. "We're losing containment." Traskin slammed his clawed fist into the console, his tendrils thrashing. "Evacuate the station," he ordered. "Send a distress signal to the fleet." Valara hesitated. "If we abandon the station, we'll lose everything. The data, the experiments." "Forget the experiments," Traskin roared. "This is about survival now." Before Valara could respond, the lights in the control room flickered and went out. The only illumination came from the dim glow of the emergency backup systems. A voice echoed through the room, low and steady. "No running." Traskin froze. The voice wasn't coming from the console. It was coming from the room itself. "Garrett?" he whispered. Garrett stood in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the faint light of the corridor. His expression was calm, almost serene, but his eyes burned with intensity. "You thought you could experiment on us," he said, stepping into the room. "Use us as lab chattel. Break us. But you didn't understand what you were dealing with." Traskin backed away, his tendrils trembling. "We only wanted to understand," he stammered. To study your resilience, your adaptability." "By torturing us?" Garrett interrupted, his voice rising. "By treating us like animals?" Valara moved toward the console, her claws fumbling for a weapon. Garrett noticed her, but didn't react. He stepped closer to Traskin, his gaze never wavering. "You thought we were weak," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. But we're not like you. We don't break. We don't surrender. Traskin swallowed hard, his throat dry. What do you want? Garrett tilted his head, considering the question. Justice, he said finally, for every one of us you hurt. For every life you thought you could play God with. He turned to Valara, his expression hardening. And you'll start by telling me how to shut this place down. Valara hesitated, her claws hovering over the console. If I do that, we'll all... You're out of options, Garrett interrupted. You've seen what we're capable of. Do you really want to see how far we'll go? Valara glanced at Traskin, then back at Garrett. Her shoulders sagged in defeat. Slowly, she began inputting commands into the console. The station shuddered as systems began to shut down. Lights flickered, and the hum of the reactor grew quieter. In the corridors, humans moved with purpose, their faces set with grim resolve. Garrett watched as Valara worked. Good, he said. Now... A hiss of smoke and energy as Valara used the console to intentionally burst a conduit above Garrett's head, buying time for her to grab Traskin by the arm and pull him out of there. They ran, as fast as their plated feet could carry them towards the shuttle bay, shouting at anyone they passed to follow them or die here. Garrett took a few moments to recover from the smoke. Coughing and irritated, he turned to a shadowed corner of the room where one of the other humans had snuck in. They'll run to the nearest shuttle bay. They moved as one, a silent, unstoppable force, leaving chaos and shattered illusions in their wake. The research station groaned like a wounded beast, its systems failing one by one. The lights flickered in uneven intervals, casting long shadows across the mangled corridors. Alarms wailed, punctuated by the hiss of venting gas and the crackle of failing machinery. Outside the viewport, the dying star the station orbited flared, its light turning the scene into a hellish panorama. Garrett moved with unyielding purpose through the chaos, the remaining humans now all close behind him. Their bare feet made no sound against the alloy floors, their faces grim and resolute. The station was theirs now, every corridor, every failing system, a testament to their will to survive. Dr. Traskin stumbled into the shuttle bay, his tendrils twitching uncontrollably. Around him, panicked alien staff scrambled into evacuation pods, their voices a cacophony of fear and desperation. Valara was at his side, her dorsal plates bristling as she tried to maintain some semblance of order. Get everyone aboard! She shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. We leave in 60 seconds! Traskin barely heard her. His mind was a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. They had underestimated the humans, not just their resilience, but something deeper, something primal. He could still see Garrett's face, his calm intensity, more terrifying than any fury. They'll destroy everything, Traskin muttered, his voice barely audible. They'll burn us all. Valara grabbed his shoulder, her claws digging into his skin. Focus, Doctor! She snapped. We need to get out of here before they... A deep, resonant hum interrupted her. The shuttle bay's lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The hum grew louder, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to pulse in time with the station's failing systems. They're here, Traskin whispered. Garrett stepped into the shuttle bay, the remaining humans flanking him like shadows. Their movements were unnervingly synchronized, their silence more deafening than the blaring alarms. Garrett's eyes scanned the room, locking onto Traskin and Valara. No escape, he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Not for you. The alien staff froze, their panic momentarily forgotten as they stared at the humans. One of the guards, still clutching a weapon, stepped forward. Stay back, he barked, leveling his energy lance. Garrett didn't break stride. The guard fired, the bolt of energy sizzling through the air and harmlessly dissipating against a containment field Garrett had pulled from a fallen security drone. Before the guard could fire again, Garrett was upon him, disarming him with a single, brutal motion. The guard crumpled to the floor, groaning. Garrett turned to the others, his expression unreadable. "Anyone else?" The room fell silent. Valara stepped forward, her claws raised in a placating gesture. "We're leaving," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "We're abandoning the station. You've won. There's no need for more violence." Garrett tilted his head, considering her words. "Leaving? After everything you did?" "We were following orders," Valara pleaded. "It was a mistake. We see that now." "A mistake," Garrett repeated, his voice flat. He glanced at the other humans, their faces unreadable, but their eyes sharp. "Do you believe that?" One of the humans, a wiry man with a jagged scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "They didn't care when they locked us in those pods," he said, his voice low and hard. "Didn't care when they pushed our children into gas chambers just to see how long they'd last. And now they want mercy?" Garrett held up a hand, silencing him. He turned back to Valara, his expression cold. "You didn't think we'd survive long enough for there to be anyone to be guilty for, did you?" Valara didn't answer. She didn't have to. Garrett took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This isn't about survival. It's about sending a message." Traskin felt his breath catch in his throat. He had known fear before, on the battlefields where he'd directly acquire specimens, in the lab where he'd face them up close. But this was different. Garrett's presence was overwhelming, a living embodiment of everything they had failed to understand about humanity. Traskin's tendrils quivered. "Killing us won't bring you justice. It'll just make you like you," Garrett interrupted. He walked calmly to the control console of the shuttle and shot it with the lance he stole. His voice was calm, but his words carried a sharp edge. "No. We're not like you. We don't steal innocent people from their lives and call it research. We don't use children as lab rats. We don't starve people for days and weeks just to see how long it takes." He turned to the other humans, his gaze sweeping over them. "Get to the main reactor. Overload it. This place doesn't deserve to exist." Traskin's eyes widened with horror. "You'll kill everyone on board!" Garrett's gaze snapped back to him. "You think we care?" The humans moved as one, their steps echoing in unison as they left the shuttle bay. Valara stared at them, her claws trembling. "We have to stop them," she said, turning to Traskin. "How?" Traskin whispered, his voice hollow. "We couldn't control them before. What makes you think we can stop them now?" Valara didn't answer. Instead, she turned to the remaining staff. "Get to the shuttles on the other side of the station," she ordered. "Evacuate, now!" As the staff scrambled to obey, Traskin sank to his knees, his mind racing. The station, their work, everything they had built was about to be destroyed, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The reactor core was a massive, pulsating machine, its glow casting eerie shadows across the room. Garrett stood before it, his expression unreadable as he studied the controls. "This is it," he said softly. "The heart of the beast." The other humans spread out, their movements precise and deliberate. One of them began working at the console, but the alien technology eluded him. So instead he used a stolen energy lance and shot it until warning alarms began to blare. "Overload in 60 seconds, a monotone AI voice spoke. "That should give us enough time to get out," the man spoke. Garrett nodded, his gaze never leaving the reactor. "Good. Let's end this." In the second shuttle bay on the other side of the facility, Valara watched as the last of the staff boarded the evacuation pods, the doors sealed with a hiss, and the pods launched into the void, their engines flaring as they sped away from the station. "They're clear," she said, turning to Traskin. "Let's go." Traskin didn't move. He stared at the door, his tendrils drooping. "They'll follow us." "No, they'll go back and tell the rest of their species what we did. They'll destroy us all," he murmured. "It's what we deserve." Valara grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the second-to-last shuttle in this bay. "Not today," she said. "Move!" The station shuddered violently as the reactor began to overload. Garrett and the other humans sprinted through the corridors, the floor buckling beneath their feet. The path to the docking bay was a gauntlet of collapsing walls and venting gas, but they moved with unrelenting purpose. They reached the docking bay just as the first explosions rippled through the station. A single alien shuttle remained, its hatch open and engines active. Garrett paused, his gaze sweeping over the other humans. "Get aboard," he ordered. "Now." The others didn't hesitate. They filed onto the shuttle, their faces set with grim determination. Garrett was the last to board, his eyes lingering on the station as the hatch sealed behind him. "Let's go," he said. The shuttle's engines roared to life, carrying them away from the doomed station. Through the viewport, Garrett watched as the station erupted in a massive explosion, the light consuming everything in its wake. He turned away, his expression unreadable. "Never again," he said softly. The other humans nodded, their silence speaking louder than words, as the shuttle plotted a course back to Earth.